My name is Myra. I'm 31 years old, and it's taken me a long time to admit this out loud. I used to believe that if I planned the perfect trip, soft enough, thoughtful enough, maybe my parents would sit down for one meal together, for the first time in 5 years since their divorce. Not to fix anything, not to start over, just to sit, like adults, and eat in the same room without the tension hanging off every fork. So I planned it in silence, booked the villa, mapped out the flights, the food, the timing, the weather, even the color of the napkins. No one asked me to do it, but I did because I thought, if I made things beautiful enough, they wouldn't break any further. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't the one they were waiting to eat with. Because when I arrived at the seaside villa I had reserved weeks ago, the first person to greet me wasn't my mother. It wasn't my father either. It was the woman holding his hand, pouring tea into the cup I had picked for my mother. The last time my parents were in the same room was 5 years ago, in a courthouse with cold tile floors and silence louder than their lawyer. My mother stayed in the house I grew up in. My father moved 3 towns over. My younger brother chose to go with him, and I stayed somewhere in the middle, not physically, emotionally. I became the bridge no one asked for, but everyone quietly walked across. I was the one who remembered birthdays, who sent flowers from both of us, even when both hadn't spoken in months. The one who photoshopped smiles into family calendars, because I thought pretending might hold the pieces together a little longer. I bought my father a new scarf every winter and signed my mother's name. I helped my mother fix the fence and said Dad would have done it if he were here. He wouldn't have, but she smiled like she believed it. Every Christmas, I wrapped gifts for my brother and sent them to Dad's apartment. Because no one wanted to ask whose house he should visit, he usually didn't come to either. I told myself I was keeping things from getting worse. But really, I was just the one willing to carry the weight no one else wanted to admit existed. They never asked me to do it. That was the hard part. No one ever asked me to fix anything. But when things stopped breaking, they all moved on like it was inevitable. Like peace was just waiting to happen on its own. No one thanked me, but no one noticed the cost either. And maybe that's why I thought this trip could be different. Maybe if I gave them something real, a place, a view, a memory, they'd finally look up and see me not just as the quiet one who smooths the edges, but as someone who still wanted to sit at the table. Jeju Island wasn't just a vacation idea. It was a memory. When I was 9, we visited for a weekend. Before the cracks began, before silence became the default, I remembered how my mom smiled at the cliffs, how my dad let go of his phone for a full day, how the three of us shared one umbrella in a downpour, and somehow laughed the whole way back to the hotel. That memory stayed soft in my chest like sea foam, always just out of reach but never really gone. So I booked a villa on the southern coast, 3 bedrooms, one for my mom, one for my dad, one for me. Enough space to breathe, but close enough to remember. I chose late autumn, when the island smells like mandarin peels and the air hums with quiet. I planned an evening seafood dinner at the same cliffside restaurant my mom once said she dreamed of returning to. I reserved seats for the Camellia Hill Walk, picked the table with the best sunset view, called the host ahead of time to ask if they still lit candles at dusk. I wrote out the schedule on soft linen cards, folded them in handmade envelopes, and sealed each with a pressed flower. I sent nothing, just brought them with me, to hand over in person. Quietly, gently, I even added small things, Mom's favorite tea in the welcome basket, Dad's preferred seat by the window, A framed photo from that old trip, tucked into the bookshelf between two poetry books. I used my own savings, didn't ask anyone to contribute, didn't mention the price, didn't expect anything in return. I just wanted them to arrive, to walk into something that felt warm, intentional, and maybe, just maybe, healing. That was the plan, not to impress, not to force forgiveness, just to offer a moment where we could exist, without tension, without sides, without keeping score. A meal, a weekend, a memory to replace the ones that broke us. I told myself if it worked, I wouldn't need to say anything. They'd feel it. I arrived a few hours early. The villa sat on a quiet hill overlooking the sea, with stone steps leading up to a whitewashed doorway, and rosemary growing along the fence line. I unpacked slowly, placed the flower arrangements on the table, lit the vanilla and cedarwood candle Mom always liked, hung the soft robes on the bedroom doors, and then I waited. I kept checking my phone. Nothing from Mom, nothing from Dad. Until a message popped up, just a simple line from my mother. We ended up switching to another villa closer to the town center. Ha-yoon said the location works better. Ha-yoon, I reread the text. Once, twice, my fingers didn't move. My heart did. I sent back a short reply. I'm already here. This place is ready. No answer. I sat for a while. The wind outside had shifted. The candle flickered like it knew what I hadn't yet accepted. Then, against better judgment, I packed everything back up. The tea, the envelopes, even the pressed photo. And I drove across the island to the new address. When I pulled into the driveway, I could see them through the glass windows. My mom standing by the kitchen island. My dad laughing softly at something. And a woman, maybe early 40s, with sleek hair and expensive posture, pouring wine into tall glasses. She handed one to my father and placed her hand gently on his back. That was Ha-yoon, and I stood outside the glass, holding a basket of thoughtful things. No one had asked for any more. I knocked, not because I wanted to be invited in, but because not knocking felt worse. My mother opened the door with surprise that didn't quite look real. "Oh, Myra, you made it," she said, like I had stumbled into their plans, not the other way around. She gestured me in. I stepped over the threshold of a space I hadn't prepared, into a room I had not been considered for. My father nodded. Ha-yoon smiled. That was all. No one asked why I was late. No one mentioned the other villa. No one asked what I had planned. At dinner, the table was set for 4, but I wasn't hungry. Not for the food, not for the performance. And when Mom complimented the wine, she added, "Ha-yoon picked it. She really thought of everything." I didn't say a word, just watched the flickering of the candle in front of me, the one I hadn't lit. I used to think being quiet made me strong, that if I could hold it all in, the questions, the hurt, the loneliness, it meant I was mature, resilient, graceful, but sitting at that table, listening to my father laugh at a joke Ha-yoon made, while my mother complimented her taste in linen, I realized something else entirely. Quiet can also be the sound of being erased. They didn't ignore me out of cruelty. They simply adjusted around me, like a chair no longer needed. No one asked where I had been. No one asked what I had planned. No one even seemed to remember the place I had prepared. And I knew, in that moment, I was not part of the mistake. I was simply not part of the picture. The next morning, I woke up early, made tea in silence, watched the steam rise and curl like a question without an answer. I thought about saying something, pulling my mother aside, asking her why she changed the plan without telling me, why she let Ha-yoon take the space I had been holding for weeks. But I didn't, because I knew how the conversation would go. It wasn't a big deal. You're overreacting. You should have spoken up sooner. So instead, I packed my bag, left the tea where it was, and drove back to the original villa, the one I had booked, the one still waiting, quiet and empty. Like a version of me I hadn't met yet, I didn't cry. Not then. I made the bed, took one of the linen envelopes from my suitcase, slipped the photo back inside. Then I sat on the edge of the window seat and watched the tide come in. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I was just tired. Tired of being the one who remembers, while everyone else forgets. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table of the villa I had originally booked, the one they never stepped foot in, and opened my laptop. There, in a separate folder, were the details of every reservation. The restaurant deposit, the car service, the florist who arranged the bouquet for the anniversary table. That would never be set. I looked at the breakdown. Every charge was on my card. Every little effort, quietly paid for and quietly overlooked. And suddenly, I saw it for what it was. Not generosity, not family duty, not love. It was a pattern, one I had been funding for years. Emotionally, financially, invisibly. So I clicked the button, the one labeled, Cancel Card. It asked me to confirm. I did. Then I logged into the shared payment platform, the one my parents used for groceries, utilities, vacations, subscriptions I had set up for their convenience, but had long stopped using myself. And I ended it all. Politely, cleanly, no explanation. A few hours later, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. Do you know why my card isn't working at the pharmacy? No greeting, no warmth. Just confusion, wrapped in entitlement. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the keyboard, and I typed, might want to check the expiration date. That was it. No confrontation, no apology demanded, no lecture given. Just a quiet click, and the freedom that followed. I didn't tell them I'd left the other villa. I didn't tell them I was still on the island, because they weren't really looking for me anyway. I didn't go home. Instead, I rented a car and drove north, following a winding road into the hills near Hallessen, where the air turned colder, and the cell signal thinned into silence. There was a retreat center tucked behind a line of pine trees. Not quite a monastery, not quite a hotel, just a place for people who needed space. They didn't ask questions at the front desk, just handed me a key and pointed to a room with a single bed, a small window, and a folded blanket that smelled like soap and cedar. For the first time in a long while, no one there knew who I was. No one referred to me as her daughter, or his sister, or the one who handles everything. They just called me Mira, plain and simple, and somehow that felt like a beginning. Each morning, I swept the stone paths around the gardens, helped prepare tea for guests, sat in stillness while the wind moved through the tall grasses. No one praised me for it. No one expected more. And I didn't have to explain where I had been, why I hadn't returned home, or what went wrong. It was the first time my silence felt like mine, not something imposed or punished, but something chosen. One afternoon, I found a small notebook in the common room. Inside were blank pages and a single sentence written on the front flap. Write what doesn't need to be said out loud. So I did. I wrote about the dinner that never happened, the photo that never made it to a frame, the seat I had saved that no one sat in, the moment I realized I was never part of the plan, only the one who made it. And when I finished, I tore the page out, folded it into an envelope, and buried it under a camellia tree. Not for drama, not for closure, just so it could live somewhere other than my chest. I stayed for 6 days, No phone, no updates, no family check-ins. And not once did anyone ask me where I belonged. Because I wasn't someone's daughter, I was just Myra. And that was enough. On the 7th morning, I turned my phone back on. It took a while to load, as if even the device hesitated to pull me back into a world I had quietly stepped out of. There were a few missed calls, one from my father, two from my brother, none with voicemails, and then a message from my mother. No greeting, just this: let us know when you're ready to come home. Ha-yoon wants to plan something for the holidays. I read it twice, then once more. Not a word about the trip I had built, not a question about where I had gone, not a single mention of the silence that had filled the space between us. It wasn't malicious. It was indifferent. The kind of message you send when someone's absence feels more like an inconvenience than a loss. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, not because I wanted to punish her, but because, for the first time, I understood that silence could be something I owned, not something I endured. That evening, I walked back to the camellia tree, where I'd buried my letter. The petals had started to fall, soft and red like the kind of apology no one ever says out loud. And I stood there, hands in my pockets, breathing in the cold mountain air, and whispering, not to anyone else, but to the girl I had been. You don't owe them your peace if they keep breaking it just to borrow warmth. I left the retreat the next morning. No ceremony, no grand goodbye, just a folded blanket, a washed cup, and a note I left on the nightstand that read, "Thank you for not asking who I belonged to." I drove without music, letting the hum of the engine carry me through the winding roads. Like a lullaby, I didn't have to translate. When I returned to my apartment, everything was just as I left it. Quiet, still, slightly dusty. But mine, no one had rearranged the furniture. No one had taken up my space. I unpacked slowly, lit a candle, and taped a small sticky note to my bathroom mirror. 5 words, written in my handwriting, a promise I meant to keep. I owe myself the most. I used to think that saying no would make me cold, distant, ungrateful. But I've learned that sometimes, no isn't the end of a relationship. It's the beginning of a boundary, and boundaries are not walls. They're doors that remind us you can't keep walking into someone's life if you keep leaving your respect at the threshold. So no, I'm not their fixer, not their fallback, not their plan B. I am not their emergency contact. For the messes they won't name, I am Myra, no prefix, no role. Just a woman, with a name, a center, and a quiet she no longer apologizes for. If this story stirred something in you, maybe you've been there too. The empty chair, the forgotten invitation, the silent helper who's never handed a seat. If so, you're not alone. Leave a comment below that simply says, "I was Myra once," because your words might be the light someone else is waiting to see. And if you're ready to begin again, this time for you, you're in good company here.